Hi, I'm Will Johnson, also known as Power Nerd Insights. I work as a Senior Power Platform Specialist for Vantage 365, and I'd like to welcome you to this Power Nerd presentation.
Hello everyone, welcome to this Friday learning session in the Power Apps Challenge server. We run these essentially learning sessions for everyone to learn, and this week's topic is going to be application lifecycle management. So during this session, we're going to be looking at Power Platform's offerings in terms of application lifecycle management, how we enable it. We're also going to be covering some of the theory about application lifecycle management in terms of what application lifecycle management is, why it's important for what we do as Power Platform developers, how it works in Power Platform, and then some of the application lifecycle management tools that we have available to us, like I said. So, with that being said, we'll launch into our session today. So we do have a bit of an agenda for this session. Looking at that agenda, what we have in place is the introduction. That's where we are now. Hi. Like I said, we're going to be covering what application lifecycle management or ALM is and why it's important for what we do as Power Platform developers. We're going to look at how application lifecycle management works in Power Platform specifically, because application lifecycle management applies to pretty much any kind of application development. However, there are some intricacies and unique kind of components that come with Power Platform and some parts of Power Platform that make application lifecycle management a lot easier. And then we're going to start to dig into what our options for application lifecycle management are. We're going to look at three options. We're going to start with the very basics of application lifecycle management within Power Platform, where we'll look at solutions and kind of how we use them. We're then going to look at some of the automation tools that we have available to us. So we'll start with application lifecycle management with Power Platform pipelines. Okay, so obviously we're then going to cover what our options are for application lifecycle management when it comes to Power Platform. So we're going to cover some basic application lifecycle management, look at solutions and how we do kind of the basic level of application lifecycle management within Power Platform. We're then going to look into the automation tools that we use within Power Platform to make our application lifecycle management just a little bit more snazzy, a little bit better. So we're going to look at kind of the meteor option, which is Power Platform pipelines, which affords us kind of application lifecycle management automation opportunities without the need for learning pro code. And then we're going to look at application lifecycle management with Azure DevOps pipelines. We're going to look at how we implement them and how we can make them a little bit easier to access as well, because normally they do require an element of pro code in terms of YAML to be able to create, but there are steps we can do to make that a bit easier. And then, as always, we'll have our discussion section at the end where everybody's welcome to kind of provide their viewpoint, provide their experience, ask their questions, and kind of go from there. But as always, we start with our rules of engagement. I only have one rule for these sessions. That is that there is no such thing as a stupid question. I firmly believe this. We're all here to learn. We're all here to do better. If you have a question, please do ask it. Doubtless, if you have the question, then someone else does, and we want to be able to help and learn. So with that being said, let's start on the theory side of application lifecycle management with one of the things we really do have to know before we get into it. And that is, what is application lifecycle management or ALM, and why is it important? Well, at its very core, application lifecycle management refers to the management of applications or solutions we produce through the different stages of their life. That life cycle includes everything from inception in terms of when you start to do user research and start to map out what the solution might look like and start to design it, all the way through to delivery, deployment, maintenance, and eventually deprecation, so the end of that solution or that application's life. And at each of these stages, we need to ensure we're handling what we build, the applications we deploy correctly. And application lifecycle management is essentially the practice of doing that. In terms of benefits and why it's important when we look at application lifecycle management, it ensures we have solid quality in terms of our application build. So application lifecycle management can help us introduce checks and make sure we have checks in place so that when we're deploying solutions as part of that application lifecycle management, we are able to ensure standards and processes are adhered to, that we're able to kind of ensure that we're doing things in the right way so that we're not just randomly deploying things into production that might break break kind of the production side of things. Alongside this, as we'll see today, there are tools that mean we can automate some of the checks and the actual deployment processes, meaning that we can have faster development to deployment timelines. So when we have a good application lifecycle management practice in place, we can start to reduce some of the manual checks required, automate them out using the tools that we're going to explore today, but also ensure that we can kind of speed up that deployment process. In some cases as well, we can improve our ability to collaborate on solutions that we use within the Power Platform. And we'll get to see a little bit of that later in terms of when we start to look at pipelines, Azure DevOps pipelines, and being able to edit the kind of core unpacked version of a solution. In terms of real life examples as well as to why application lifecycle management is really important, and this one is especially relevant to Power Platform. One of the major practices that we're going to see with application lifecycle management when we get to the basics is ensuring you set up a pipeline of environments in terms of a dev, test, and production environment. The reason we do that is we make all our changes in dev and we mess around with dev data and then we test it in test and then we move it to production, because once we've done dev and test, we know it works. If you avoid this and attempt to just build your solution in production, a lot of the time that might not cause you issues initially if you're lucky, but if you then ever need to edit or add functionality to your solution or even just test a new function, then those changes are occurring in the live environment, and during that development process of making those changes and those edits, you could have a wider impact on the daily operations of your business where you've deployed the solution that could be detrimental. So application lifecycle management is really key for a few things in terms of ensuring we have the checks and balances in place to not damage production systems, but also to ensure we're adhering to proper standards, we have proper review cycles, and also to make it so that we have an easy way of being able to adjust a solution without impacting current business operations. So that is essentially a definition of what application lifecycle management is and why it's important from an application perspective. So how does application lifecycle management work in Power Platform? Well, Power Platform actually has a number of components, tools, and processes that enable application lifecycle management within the Power Platform space. We're going to kind of go in order of size here, going from kind of the top to the bottom. So the very first thing that enables application lifecycle management in Power Platform is environments. Now, you heard me mention these briefly in the last slide, talking about setting up a pipeline of environments in terms of dev, test, and prod. But we need to understand what environments are. Well, essentially, these are a space. I tend to think of it as a bit of a box that allows me to manage and share things like business data, apps, flows, and kind of the objects that we create as Power Platform devs. They also act as containers to separate apps or solutions that might have different functions or security requirements or even target audiences. So it depends on how the environment strategy the business you're working for is set up. But I've seen some businesses have a environment strategy that states, hey, we're going to have a finance, dev, test, and production environment set. And any applications or solutions that deal with finance data or have a target audience of the finance team are going to sit within that dev, test, and production cycle between those three environments. To the point of application lifecycle management, one thing that Microsoft has done that is very, very useful is when we actually create a new environment, we can select an environment type within the admin center. So they have two environment types that are relevant towards application lifecycle management. They are sandbox and production. Sandbox environments work slightly differently to production environments. Sandbox should be selected for any non-production environments such as dev and test. And then you have the production environment, which, as the type suggests, should be chosen for the environment where you are going to carry out your production kind of day-to-day work, where your important information is going to sit. The next level down, once we've gotten our environment sorted out, is solutions. Now, one of the things I tend to kind of teach when I first start working with people when they're looking at application lifecycle management and Power Platform is you should build what you're building inside of a solution from the very start. It's very, very handy. but having an understanding of what solutions are and what they do is kind of important. So solutions are the backbone of application lifecycle management when it comes to Power Platform. They act as the boxes that hold all the components of our solutions. So these are anything that is a web resource, an app, a table if you're using Dataverse, your business process flows, your Power Automate flows. Even your Copilot agents are what are known as solution aware and can be added to a solution. These solutions then act as the mechanism for implementing application lifecycle management. You use these solutions to distribute the components that are inside them across environments through export of the solution from one environment and import into another environment. We're going to get to see that process with the basic ALM piece that we'll come to next. That kind of component represents essentially an object utilized in your solution and something that you can potentially customize. Anything that can be included in a solution is a component. So it's worthwhile knowing that, like I said, it covers pretty much anything that you can customize. So when we look at this, these solutions are really, really key. They are boxes that we can essentially zip up or tape up and send to another environment and put them in place, and they then deploy that solution. But not only that, we're going to get to see it a little bit later in today's session when we come to DevOps pipelines, that they don't just basically zip up and then you put them somewhere else. In certain situations, we can actually unzip them, unpack them, and export them as source code into a source control system such as Azure DevOps, so that we can enable things like people working directly in the code base before then going on to deploy. And this actually leads on to the third bit in terms of what Power Platform does to enable ALM and how it works at Power Platform. Source control. We know this predominantly as version control. In application lifecycle management and Power Platform, the purpose of source control / version control is to track changes to anything within our solution. The source control system of Power Platform specifically allows us to roll back things like changes that have been made to objects, changes that have been made to environments, and is exceptionally important when multiple people are working on a single solution. And the ability to roll back and have this source control is a key component of proper application lifecycle management. That source control system helps organizations kind of achieve that healthy application lifecycle management because the assets maintained in the source control system are seen as the single source of truth. When you look at that, that should be the one thing that represents your solution. There shouldn't be duplicates kind of here, there, and everywhere. And in terms of how that works with specifically Power Platform solutions, we have a level of version control there in terms of solution layers. But alongside that, we have the option to export and import solutions as either managed or unmanaged. Now, managed solutions are essentially a uneditable version to some degree of a solution that you have taken from somewhere else. And we'll see a little bit later what the difference is between managed and unmanaged solutions when it comes to application lifecycle management. But it's really important that we understand that source control is a key part of that. So ensuring that we have proper version history for our solutions through the tools provided us in Power Platform is really useful when it comes down to that. So we've covered a lot of the theory here, which is very useful. We understand kind of what components are available to us in Power Platform. When we look at kind of what components work with Power Platform to enable ALM, we now understand what ALM is. We understand the benefits it provides. But what are our actual options when it comes to Power Platform application lifecycle management? How do we actually implement it? What should it look like? Well, basic ALM, that's where we start. This is very much a manual process. It's where a lot of people start when it comes to application lifecycle management. And I'm going to give you an example of how this runs. So if you bear with me one moment. You can see here, I am in an environment. So right there is Dev Kitchen environment. I've got a load of them. And let's say I build all my unmanaged solutions. I've got a load of them here, a load of unmanaged solutions. I build them in my dev environment here, and actually I want to move them into the default environment. Okay. Well, great. I've built my solution. What I now want to do is do the manual process of exporting it, importing them, conducting application lifecycle management to deploy it to another environment? Well, if I click onto the solution here and I hit overview, you can see that, hey, it's a help desk ticketing system. Great. It's an unmanaged package. But what does that mean? Well, the unmanaged package basically means that I can edit anything I want in here. Now, from a perspective of application lifecycle management, if we have a solution in test or production, we probably don't want that to be edited. So how do we change that? Well, actually, that comes in the deployment space. But before we even get to the deployment space and the kind of change that packet type, there is one thing that's very, very useful that Power Platform does from an application lifecycle management point of view. And it's this solution checker option here. Now, if I hit run check on this, what it's going to do is it's going to go away. It's going to identify if there are any issues with this solution that are going to prevent me from deploying it to another environment. Now, if we wait for that to run, it'll then return things like, hey, you might have a missing dependency. If that dependency isn't present in your target environment, the place you're going to deploy it to, it's not going to deploy properly. So now I'm aware of that. It means I can fix that before I then go and try and, deploy my solution somewhere else. So one of the things I do teach from a basic kind of application lifecycle management perspective, taking your first foray in Power Platform into the application lifecycle management space, is before you do any kind of exports or deployments, is run your solution checker. Make sure you get that into good practice, because there you're going to see issues that might prevent you from deploying, such as dependency issues. But not just that, it'll also report for you anything that might have an impact on accessibility, which is really, really useful to understand from a perspective of, a lot of the times when we're developing these, we forget to add accessibility labels or tab indexes or things like that. The solution checker will actually pull those in. If it works. Apparently we're not working today. But yes, in terms of application lifecycle management, we want to run that solution checker and get that information. Once we've run that and it returns and says, hey, we're all good, we don't have any critical errors, we don't have any critical failings, the basic application lifecycle management then goes on to the export. It'll ask you to make sure you've published all changes. It's always useful to hand that, because if you're ready, all of this is ready and you want to publish, you probably want to make sure you've got all the customizations coming across. If you haven't published all the customizations and you then go to export it, what will happen is it'll export to the layer that is already published. You won't have any of your pending unpublished changes come through, and you might want those in your solution. Now, it's worthwhile noting that while we're on this page, you can see this option here, want to make this faster, start the deployment pipeline, start the deployment process. This is a prompt for you to look at Power Platform pipelines, which is the low-code automated version of deployment. It will essentially do a lot of the tasks that I'm about to show you that we're doing manually automatically, plus you can do a few other things. We'll actually get into that in a little bit in terms of what it does, how it works. Clearly today, however, I appear to be cursed when it comes to demos. Okay, there we go. So you can see there we've got a version number, and we've got the option to choose managed or unmanaged. So this is where we change what package type we're exporting. So you can see here, managed. The solution is moving to a test or production environment. So from an application lifecycle management perspective, from the very basics of application lifecycle management in terms of our solutions, if we are deploying this solution to a test or production environment, we should choose the managed option. The only place a unmanaged solution should be is in the dev environment where the solution is being worked on or edited. We shouldn't be doing edits in test or production. So for the purpose of this, I'm going to show exporting this as a managed solution. And what you'll get is a nice grey banner up here at the top that says, hey, we're currently exporting this. Give us a few minutes, and then it should be ready. Once that little grey banner disappears, we'll have a little download button that appears over here, and the bar will go green. When you press that, what will then happen is you'll download a zip folder. Now, we don't need to worry about kind of unpacking that zip folder at the moment. Power Platform's application lifecycle management in terms of the basics working with it accepts that. Great. Okay, give me 2 moments. That's it telling me, hey, we've got an issue here. Let's work with a different solution. See, this is what happens when you try to do things earlier in the day. let's go for library tracking system. So we just wait for that to essentially populate in. We could tell it's Microsoft build next week. Power Platform's running slowly, as is Microsoft 365. Okay, so there we go. We can see that's turned green. We've got the option to download. We hit that. And you can see there, download just there. Now, I would then go to my target environment. So I want to bring it in default. And then quite simply, Solutions tab over here, hit Import Solution, hit Browse, Downloads, and then select the file. Hit Next. Missing dependencies. So this is why we run Solution Tracker. And it's because I've got Power Pages installed in the other environment. So this is a worthwhile thing noting. If you've got Power Pages or anything else installed in another environment, it does add dependencies to your item. In terms of importing that, it becomes a bit difficult. Let's try. I tell you what, I've got a backup solution I know I can use. There you go. So you see currently importing solution SMS student management system. Now this one is an unmanaged kind of solution. So we'll be able to see that import in. For a 2-table system, it is running slow today. Okay, while that's importing, because that is an unmanaged, let's go to the managed layer. So you can see here there's a load of what are known as managed solutions, loads of dynamic stuff and a few other bits. The distinction between the managed and unmanaged, essentially, if I click into, let's say, this one here, you can see nice little yellow banner. You cannot directly edit the objects within the managed solution. If the managed properties for solution objects are set to allow customization, you can edit them from another unmanaged solution. Obviously, in this one, there is no objects. But if I was to select, let's say, I know the Data First Accelerator app has one in there, and I try to go to apps, and I go there, edit is grayed out. So the distinction between the managed and unmanaged is essentially the ability to edit the objects within that solution. And again, in terms of good application lifecycle management, when we look at our dev environment, that's where our unmanaged solutions should sit. And the managed solutions should sit in our test and production environments. So that's kind of a flavor of the basic application lifecycle management in terms of first interactions, how it used to be done as well before we had the automated tooling, in terms of how we move solutions from one environment to another, what that looks like, what we should do. But really, what we want to know is what are the pros and cons of it? You know, what does it include? Well, pros for basic application lifecycle management in terms of just importing and exporting solutions. It's simple to set up and understand. There's no special tools required. It's good for small teams or early stage projects where you're maybe only working with 3 environments, and you have full control over when and what is moved. But the cons, there's no automation. You are relying on kind of human work, and there is possible human error. There's very limited audit trail with this. It's difficult to track changes or deployments into the environment. And the biggest con from my side, it relies on trust. Anyone can export or import without oversight. That means if you are running a citizen developer community within your business, someone who thinks they have built a brilliant solution could bring it into production or bring it into test and break things and introduce dependencies that you're not aware of because they've got the access to do that. The other con, it can be time consuming and inconsistent as team size grows. So for instance, if you haven't set your standards and kind of processes up correctly, someone might decide, hey, I don't need to run solution checker for this one, and then bring it in. Someone might turn around and go, well, you know what, actually, I'll just export this as unmanaged and import it into test because I might need to do some quick fixes in test or production. Obviously, if we don't have that automation there, things can go wrong. But what are our options for automation? Well, we've actually got 2. One of them is an out-of-the-box kind of solution to some degree from kind of Microsoft and is Power Platform Pipelines. And the other one is Azure DevOps Pipelines. We're actually going to see both today. Azure DevOps Pipelines is a lot more pro code, and is when you get to very much enterprise scale kind of deployments and when you need significant source control. And Power Platform pipelines is for kind of when you're dealing in the medium space, but can be really, really good in terms of being able to extend it and make citizen dev deployment a lot easier. So we're going to start with Power Platform pipelines. And actually, fortunate enough, we're in the right environment for it. So Power Platform Pipelines is a Dynamics 365 deployable app. It's deployed from the admin center onto a relevant environment. So I'm just going to come into the admin center here, and I'm going to go to my default environment. Now, where you've got a Dynamics 365 app enabled environment, you have this option over here called Dynamics 365 apps. If you click on there, you're looking for a very specific app. So bear with me one moment. Let's see if it shows in here. He says, have they changed the name of it? I hope not. Deployment pipeline configuration. When we come over to solutions, let's say I create a new solution that's called pipeline deployment test. And hey, breaking all the usual rules here, I'm just going to use the default publisher. I'm going to hit create on that and just quickly add in, let's say, a connection reference. Great. Brilliant. I've built an amazing solution. It's prepped and ready. I'm going to hit publish all customizations. I don't need to do anything else, but actually I now want to deploy this amazing solution into my pipelines test environment. It's quite surprising that publishing all customizations is taking this long for a single connection reference. There we go. So that's succeeded. Great. Now all I've got to do is I've got this nice little it's disappeared. I've got this nice little deploy button here. I click that and hey, it's going to go choose your pipeline, please. And I want to deploy it now. I don't want to deploy it later. I'm just going to hit that and great. Next. It runs through the validation in terms of solution checker, checking for any missing dependencies or other items. Hit next again. And hey, there we go. It said we're going to run this stage deployment to test. We got the publisher, we got the prefix, we got the version, and great, we've got deployment notes. So then we hit deploy. And what we should see if we come across to pipelines here and we go pipelines dashboard is we have a pipelines test currently running. There we go. Run history. Pipelines test currently deploying. Great. So it's doing what it needs to do. And what we should end up seeing is once that's run through, it'll say it's deployed it. Now, obviously, in terms of differences, now that we've set up that pipeline, I could share that pipeline to anybody in the environment and say, hey, you have the permissions to run this pipeline. Go ahead. If I were to add in those kind of extra steps in terms of the approvals for deployment or the review of the file itself, that means that we can have people who are environment administrators look over the solutions that are coming in, ensure they're not going to cause any issues, and then move forward. And because that's all automated as well, it's going to be a repeatable process. It's going to be something that we can make sure lasts and works, because now all we've got to do is say, hey, just come in, hit the deploy button. Don't export it. We can define whether it deploys as a managed or an unmanaged solution. We can define, how it works, how it runs, and make it repeatable. So that is Power Platform pipelines. Very useful, and actually, I'd like to say a relatively recent thing, but it has been a bit of time since they've been there. They can be very, very useful. And I think personally, I find the biggest use for them will be if you are running a citizen developer kind of community within your businesses. What you could end up with is essentially setting up these pipelines and saying to your citizen developers, hey, when you're ready for something to be used in earnest, use the pipeline for it. We have a way of deploying that. Okay. So what is our next one? This is where we're going to start to get into the more pro code side of things. So we're going to start to look at Azure DevOps pipelines. Before we do that, Power Platform pipelines, pros and cons. As we've seen, one of the major pros, this is citizen dev friendly. It has a low code approach. The UI is easy to pick up. There's built-in governance with environment roles and approvals that you configure to make sure that someone has the right permissions to be able to deploy and do other things. You have auditable logs tracked against your deployments through the graphs at the front and the run histories, and it enforces that consistency in moving managed solutions. So it will deploy it as managed solution. The other thing as well, there is a zero code setup, no YAML, no scripting, nothing. Just clicking through a kind of an interface that we're all very familiar with when it comes to model-driven apps. But what are the cons? Well, they are less customizable than Azure DevOps or custom deployment pipelines. It still requires users to manually trigger deployments as well, so they have to be the one to push it. It doesn't support complex branching. For instance, if a solution has a specific name, you can't test for that and then direct it to a different environment. It's very much linear. And it doesn't allow for rollback scenarios in terms of, no, we try to deploy that, don't do it, let's just roll it back, it doesn't work. The other thing as well, it only supports Dataverse-backed solutions, right? So you have to be inside of a solution for this to work because we are targeting solutions specifically, which from a Power Platform dev perspective is brilliant. We're not building complex kind of application lifecycle management pipelines that aren't good, that don't interact with kind of solutions. We're building everything in solutions anyway. And then one of the other things is there's a level of limited integration with external tools that you might be using, such as GitHub or Jira, unless you do the extension yourself through Power Platform and through Power Automate using custom connectors and things like that as part of your either pre-export steps or your pre-deployment steps. So, Azure DevOps pipelines. So this is where things get into the pro code kind of space. Few things to note in terms of setting up Azure DevOps pipelines. They are not managed through Power Platform. There are a few things you need to do. You need to have an Azure DevOps kind of account. If you go to ax.dev.azure.com, you need to have a DevOps organization and you need to have a project within that. So if I click on a test project agile, this is my lovely test project here once it loads. And you can see here we've got repos and pipelines. So you can see here I've got a failed run. We're not, as a heads up, we're not going to be able to see a running pipeline in Azure DevOps today, purely because it's decided I have run out of credits for the meantime. But we have pipelines here. We need to understand how we set them up, what we need as prerequisites to set them up, and then how they run. So we'll start with the prerequisites. Like I said, you need a DevOps environment, you need the access to pipelines, you need a project within there, and more than likely you're going to need a repo in there as well. The other thing you're going to need is to be able to configure what's known as service connections for Power Platform within kind of Azure DevOps. Now, to do that, you need to register a client, an app registration, and then create client secrets for that app registration. And in terms of the permissions that the app registration will require, is the dynamic CRM user impersonation permission under delegated. The only option you have for this one is delegated, and then the user read delegated permission as well. And you'll need to grant admin consent for them. So be aware these are some prerequisites that you may not have worked before. You will need to have, like I said, the app registration and then the Azure DevOps kind of organization and project. And then the next thing you need to do is set up service connections. I'm actually going to show you how to create those service connections now. So you have this section within your project. You come down to project settings just here. And then under pipelines, you have service connections, just there. If you want to create a new service connection, you come over to here to new service connection. And there are multiple service connection types. The one that we are after is Power Platform. So you choose that, hit next. And what it's going to do is going to say, hey, you can create these using application ID and client secret, Azure managed identities or workload identity federation. In terms of what I tend to do is I use an application ID and secret. You paste a server URL in there, a tenant ID, an application ID, and a client secret of application ID. So this is the secrets that you generate from that app registration. You then give it a name and then choose whether you want to grant access permission to all pipelines to be able to use that service connection. A lot of the times you're probably going to want to do that. Now I have a pre-configured service connection here. So if I hit edit, I can show you that there's a server URL, tenant ID, and a few other things. We are obviously going to use this service connection for DevOps pipelines. Once we've configured those service connections, we are actually going to need to do one more thing to be able to use one of the things that makes kind of DevOps pipelines a little bit easier from a Power Platform perspective. We're going to need the Power Platform build tools to be added to our Azure DevOps area. Now to do that, there is a little marketplace icon on the top right here. We click on that. We hit Browse Marketplace, and it takes us here. And what you're looking for is the Power Platform build tools, which should have turned up, but it doesn't look like it is. So we're going to look at Azure Pipelines. If it does the same for you, come to Azure Pipelines, hit See More, and you'll see there Power Platform build tools. That's the one you want. Now, there's a reason we install that. It's already installed on my side, but it adds a lot of extra things that we're going to need to make our life a little bit easier. Once that's been added to your Azure DevOps area, you're now ready to start actually creating pipelines. So to create your pipeline, you come into pipelines, you hit new pipeline, and then you can see here, where's your code? It's in Azure Repos Git, because we're going to start pulling our solutions and unpacking them into Azure DevOps repos, which essentially allows us to see the code base for our solution. You see there, there's a load of stuff that I've been able to pull in terms of Canvas apps, connection references, and a load of other things. And that actually allows us to then go, hey, these are environment variables, that's the Canvas app YAML, there's the controls and everything else. So we're actually now able to start to browse through the actual core code within the zip files that we normally see. Again, to create new pipeline, choose Azure Repos Git, choose the repository. You can see I've got two here and it's identified one as a fork. I'm going to choose Test Project Agile. And then it's going to say, hey, what do you want to do? Now, you've got a lot of options in here. Personally, I always just choose Start a Pipeline. And then you'll get this here. Now, this is YAML. Now, I mentioned about Power Platform pipelines being the low-code option. This is the pro-code option. But there is something we can do to make this easier on ourselves in terms of how we create these kind of YAML-based pipelines. You can see over here, I have an option called Show Assistant. If I click that, these are all the things that I can do with pipelines in terms of running things like Azure Test Plan, running PowerShell, running even command line operations. You can see there. But from a Power Platform perspective, because we've installed the Power Platform build tools, we have all of these options here that we can do inside of this pipeline. So it's a lot more customizable than the Power Platform pipelines, because we're able to do things like adding solution components, applying solution upgrades, assigning specific users as, an owner of things, or adding a user to a security role even. Being able to copy an entire environment and then create an environment or delete an environment is also possible through DevOps pipelines, deleting solutions, exporting specific data for essentially if you want to take reference data from your dev environment and put it into your test. But for the sake of today, we're going to work on the export solution one. So we hit export solution, and you can see here we've got service principal. That's the option to select. And then you choose one of your service principals that you have created. I'm going to choose DevOps pipelines. Now it's going to say, hey, environment URL. You can leave that in. That's a variable that it uses to select the environment URL that we're going to target. We put in a solution name. We choose a solution output file, where we want to put it. We choose whether we want it exported as a managed solution, and then we hit add. And there we go. It's created the kind of YAML for us. So we don't need to learn YAML too much. We just need to understand kind of how things work. So you see there, it's already highlighted, hey, you didn't fill in the solution output file. I'm not going to work. But obviously from that, once you've actually created your item, now I do have a pipeline here that I had done a few things with. So you can see here, I've exported a solution into my staging directory, which is this repo over here. And I've said, hey, I want the unmanaged zip folder and I want to manage the zip folder. So you see there, manage true, no manage properly on that one. The only difference between those two is both of these export the same solution. One of them will export as managed, one of them will export as unmanaged. And then I've got this one here. What this is doing is if I look at power, press the wrong button. If I search in, there is actually an unpack solution option in here, just there. What that'll do is I target a zip file that is a solution, and what it's going to do is it's going to extract that zip file into its core components as we saw in the repo earlier. So that then allows us to actually work on those core components in terms of the code that's inside of them. And one of the things that actually enables us to do from a application lifecycle management perspective is review the code that's in there, see if there's any PCF controls that might be using malicious script. But also it means that we can have multiple people working on one app at the same time and have it do that. And then you can see here, I've got a task that runs command line, which basically commits my changes in terms of that repo itself and gives it a nice commit message and a few other bits. Once you've done that, you essentially just hit run. Now you can set these pipelines up to run on a schedule. You can set them up to do a lot of things in terms of being able to copy an entire environment and bring it in. You can set them up to deploy solution packages. So you see there, Power Platform deploy package. If I wanted to deploy that managed solution up here in this, I could hit deploy package and it would then create the code for me once I'd filled everything in. But because we've also got all the other functionality in terms of .NET Core and being able to run command line and in some cases be able to run things like, Azure or Kubernetes, we have a lot more functionality in terms of what we can do with our solutions and how we can work with them. So that is how we set up Azure DevOps pipelines, how they work, how we extend them, and obviously some of the prerequisites that are required to be able to run it. So what are the pros and cons of Azure DevOps pipelines? Well, pros first. Complete automation and version control, source control of your solution XML via the ability to unpack it into a repository that basically runs off of kind of Git branching, forking, and proper source control variant. That leads you on to my next pro. Supports branch-based development, meaning that someone could be able to run a pull request, branch it off, do some edits, and then merge it back in. In terms of deployment controls, we have a lot more kind of fine-grained control over that kind of deployment. We can do things like approvals. We can do rollback. We can do kind of parallel deployment to multiple different target environments. We can do branching. Alongside that, one of the big pros for Azure kind of DevOps pipelines is it integrates with test automation, meaning you can run automated testing against your solution package and have it return things. And alongside that, one of the big pros, it handles things like plugins, custom codes, and one of the things I didn't get to show, but it's really, really useful, is environment variable management. You can have it identify what the required environment variable values are on the deployment and set them for you so that you don't have to worry about that, which is really, really handy because if you've ever deployed a solution with around about 50 environment variables, you know it gets a little bit laborious having to edit them. But the cons, it is a very steep learning curve. You need a good knowledge of DevOps, YAML, and scripting in terms of what you're trying to write. You can use the step assistant, but in some cases that does limit you a bit. The other con is that the initial setup time, as we've seen in terms of just gathering the prerequisites together, and effort to create one is higher. Because of that, it may be a little bit overkill for small projects or solo dev teams. The other side as well is where we have to generate client secrets for certain parts of it. those do have an expiry date. So you are going to have to be able to manage those secrets, those service connections, and a few other things. And alongside that, debugging a DevOps pipeline can be significantly more complex than dealing with a Power Platform pipeline. So what does all this mean? Well, we've now looked at what our ways of conducting application lifecycle management are, what we should be doing, what managed and unmanaged solutions are, and what solutions and environments are to some degree. With all this information, it's then down to yourselves to decide what the best approach is. However, as a very basic minimum, what I do always say is if you are working within the Power Platform space, have a dev, test, and production cycle within your kind of solution deployment. Move your solutions through that. And if you can, try to keep copies of the versions of the managed solution you deploy. That means that at any time you can then potentially look at redeploying and rolling back. That does have implications. But alongside that, it also means that if you are having to make adjustments and edits, you're not doing them in production where it could cause disruption. Other than that, pick which one you're going to go with. Give it a try. See what you find out. It's always good to experiment.
Thank you for listening. I hope you found it useful and got to learn something new, and I'll see you in the next one.